Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Niobe and for organizing this, and all of you for being here. And just say what a pleasure it is to be in a conversation about what our human condition in a broad sense and the way schools are implicated in reproducing some of the very patterns that are in many ways the most troubling, and what we can do to interrupt that reproduction. Let me start by picking up on a theme that Carol raised, and it's funny because last night we very briefly tried to talk about what are we going to talk about tomorrow, and once we started talking, then we realized we could talk all night last night, and we said, but it turns out that one of the themes she raised is really, I think, very apropos to where I want to begin, which is the idea of global warming. And I want to raise that because I think it's very analogous to what I'll call the male crisis. Right? We're in the midst of a male crisis, but it's a lot like global warming, because in the same way as you see this denial about global warming, even in the face of evidence, I would say similarly, the male crisis does not ring alarms. Right? So as in the case of global warming, we actually like global warming sometimes. Right? When it's 60 degrees in January, we say global warming is not so bad. Right? Right? And we're not even sure, is the weird weather really global warming? And yeah, it's true, there are a few islands in the South Pacific that have, kind of swallowing up, but is that really global warming? And we're not sure. Right? And I would say the same thing is true about the male crisis. And part of the reason for that is because patriarchy as a cultural system is so clearly intact. Right? This is still so much a man's world. All you have to do is look at one of those pictures when global leaders come together, where it be the G8 or the G20 or any other G they come up with. You'll maybe a woman here or there, but this is a man's group because men are running things. They're running the governments, and they're certainly running the economy. Right? Even when there is a woman in charge of the World Bank, we know that when the bankers get together, she's one of few women in the room. And that's not coincidental. Gender does seem to matter there because we know that these have been male clubs. I mean, when Carol describes going to Harvard and seeing the men on the walls who have led that institution, it's really, again, it's a historical artifact, right? That's still very much with us today. And I would say that understanding how patriarchy as a cultural system has shaped our institutions is a very important part of understanding what it means to interrupt the reproduction of gender patterns in schools. Because the signs of crisis are also clear. And they show up first and foremost in schools. Right? And all of you are seeing it now. Right? You're seeing the large number of autistic boys. We don't know why. Why should boys have much higher rates of autism than girls? Higher rates of learning disabilities than girls? Why should they be more likely to be suspended or disciplined in school than girls? To use Michael's example, why should they be more likely to shoot up their schools, Michael Kimmel, than girls? Very rare, in all these cases we've had of mass shootings, very rare to have an incident involving a young woman. And we can go on. Now we're seeing, you go to AP classes and honors courses, and increasingly what we're seeing is a shortage of young men. And at our leading institutions, there is now in every single state in the country more women than men in college. Utah was the lone holdout for a while, and now Utah has succumbed. So how could it be that in a society where men run things, run all of our leading institutions, our churches, synagogues, mosques, how could it be that women are surpassing men in education? And what does it mean for our future? What does it mean about the way boys are being raised? Is there something innately wrong? And I'm glad Lisa's here today to debunk some of that, because increasingly there are people out there, yes, there's something about the boy's brain that's different, and it's not being nurtured, and it's feminism that's done this to boys, and we need to do something to stop these women run amok that are just destroying our boys. Right? And I think a lot of us know there's something more going on here, but hard to put our finger on the nature of this crisis. And again, it's hard to use the term crisis, because if it was a crisis like an earthquake or a hurricane, there would be an urgent response. Right? That's the way we typically respond to crises. But this is not that kind of crisis. This is like global warming. It's gradual. It's hard to interpret, hard to understand, hard to pinpoint, hard to identify cause. And even if you identified cause, even if you say it's the greenhouse gases, look at how much trouble we have even thinking what to do about that, because that means some short-term sacrifice. That, as we can see, even enlightened leaders are unwilling to engage, even though they understand the implications of inaction. Well, what kinds of actions would be required to break these patterns, to save our boys? And I would say that the most troubling part for many people is a recognition that maybe it's not boys that are in trouble, but patriarchy that's in trouble. Maybe it's the whole patriarchal system that needs to be taken down and re-examined and re-engineered. Because maybe patriarchy is not simply bad for boys, maybe it's bad for all of us. And if that's the case, that is even more troubling, isn't it? And so schools are so central to this conversation, because schools are the places where we engage in the socialization of our young men. It's not the only institutions. Families obviously play a critical role in this. Because it's in schools where our naturalized assumptions about these differences, these dichotomous differences related to gender, are enacted in the way we treat our students, the way what we expect of them. And so much of that comes in not even really in the form of the formal curriculum, but what we call the hidden curriculum. I often say to my students, how many of you know what cooties are? And they all know what cooties are, except for the foreign students. And then I say, okay, explain cooties. And they explain, well, it's this disease you get when you're usually around kindergarten. It's a way to keep boys and girls apart, because the other gender has cooties. Right? And I say, who taught you to play the cooties? Did the teacher give you a lesson on cooties? And no, there's no lesson that's given on cooties, but every child in America knows about cooties. Think about it. And it's taught by other children. It's a way to ensure these separations, right? Ensure this differentiation based on gender. I often also point out to my students that there are certain kids who have permanent cooties, aren't there? Right? The outcast. Right? Who, for whatever reason, physical differences, racial differences, are the kids who are permanently cast aside. That's another part of the differentiation. We're going to talk about that one today, but an important part. But schools play such an important role in reproducing and reinforcing these differences, often through the uncontested assumptions and expectations we have about boys and girls. And it's that part that I think is what I hope we'll spend time interrogating today, because if we don't critically examine it, then we find ourselves falling right into it. Sometimes with the best of intentions. We have been studying schools, single-sex schools now, that are being created around the country to save boys. And my colleague and I, Eddie Fergus, wrote an article called An Intervention in Search of a Theory. Because they're trying to save boys, but they don't know what they're saving them from. They don't even know what the cause of the problem is. And so, although they're well-intentioned, this is a clear example where good intentions are not good enough. It's ironic, because I've also involved with schools that have been designed to save the girls. But they have a very clear sense of what it means to save girls. They're trying to save girls from the narrow gender roles that have been created, that led girls in the past to believe the only thing they could be was a nurse or a teacher or a librarian. And so now these schools are promoting science and debate and leadership and math, and they're excellent. I'm on the board of the Young Women's Leadership Academy, and these schools are excellent. Their outcomes for young women are so impressive. And I'm talking about young women from some of the most disadvantaged communities in the country. And I would say they're very clear about what they think girls need. They need to be freed from the tight, narrow confines of that gender construct. But the schools for boys, totally confused. Some of them think they need to teach young men to man up, to be real men. And some of these schools we're going into are hyper-masculine environments, where there's even more bullying, more homophobia, more harassment, because a lot of that is unchallenged, uncontested. Boys being boys. One of the articles I wrote that's probably one of the most widely read articles that I've written is an article about my son called Joaquin's Dilemma. Now, my son, he took him a while for him to forgive me for writing that article, and I know there's a tradition in some of the social sciences to use your own children for your work. And I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it because he, when he entered adolescence, went through his own crisis. He had been this young, very happy, well-rounded boy who played piano, did well in school, just delightful to be around. Then he hit 14 and suddenly changed. And he got angry. And he got, had this edge about him. And I couldn't understand it, what was going on. And then his grades took a nosedive. And he didn't want to play the piano anymore. And he started changing. And I tried to figure out what was going on. And he particularly became angry towards his mother. And I really didn't understand. He's well-fed, we take care of him. Why is he so angry? But I decided I needed to, rather than simply punish him, I needed to embrace him. Because I needed to figure out kind of what was the source of this. And the more I spent time with him, the more I realized he was going through the same thing I went through when I was at that same age. Now, it didn't manifest itself in the identical way, but I realized that part of what he was going through is we had to learn to arm himself every day he left our house. Because as a young man growing up where we lived, he understood very clearly that if you were not presenting a tough front to the world, then you would be victimized. Because the choice was either be a victimizer or a victim. Being a victim is no fun. And so he was trying out that tough front, and sometimes he had to practice at home, and I had to let him know, oh, okay, I understand outside, but when you get home, you can smile again. Relax, relax. You're with your people who love you. But I did understand that the world required that of him, because as much as we might like to protect him, we couldn't protect him as soon as he left the doors, much less when he was in school. And so I realized I had to kind of work him through, and a lot of, my mother describes adolescence as an illness, that you eventually you get through it, right, and they come out again and they're okay, right, but while they're in it, it's like they have fever and they're like, they don't think rationally, and I saw him going through this, and I figured I got to work him through this illness, and we were talking about the other night what got him through, because by the time he came to senior year, now unfortunately that was 2 years of high school lost to this crisis. Senior year, he came around again. He started smiling and went back to music and got balanced and just relaxed and everything. And we were talking about, okay, what changed for you? And he said, it did help that we maintained the relationship. It helped that I started to see things in perspective. But what really changed was he got a girlfriend. And it was actually the relationship that changed him. Because first of all, the relationship took him away from his male peers who were reinforcing some of the anger and that tough front, but it was the relationship that actually brought out the other human qualities in him, the softness in him, the ability to talk to people, that was already there but was being lost. And it was interesting because you don't want to prescribe necessarily that our children find a relationship with anybody as a cure, but I would say in some ways, and I was going to speak to it, in fact, relationships are really at the core and the crux of what's missing. And they end up showing up in so much of the work and so much of the research, the things that we've known for years, that because we are social beings, it's our absence of relationships that places us in crisis. So when we start to think about the nature of this male crisis, then maybe what we need to really think of, and goes back to the theme of today, is that we really have to think of it as a human crisis and what it means to be human. And how do we redefine and recreate norms of humanity and nurture those norms in our schools so that we are not inadvertently perpetuating the same kinds of gender constructs that we know are so injurious to so many of us, and many of us have lived them ourselves. So I want to just conclude by saying I know that the work we're trying to do it's really subtle. It's, again, like trying to understand global warming. It's not something that just immediately stands out and says, hey, this is it, this is what we've got to do. It's not that kind of a problem. It's much more subtle, it's more complex, because it actually forces each of us to look at ourselves and ask, how do we perpetuate this? In the way we treat each other, the way we think about ourselves, the way we look at our children. Because it's in our atmosphere, it's in our gene. Well, I won't bring up the genes. I'll say Leafs to talk about the genes, but it's in our. It goes right to the core of who we think we are, and what we think our role is in the world. And I think it's only when we begin to re-examine those assumptions that we can begin to imagine another way of engaging each other, relating to the world, creating schools that nurture a different kind of humanity, and hopefully creating a different kind of world. So, thank you.